Welcome back. I'm Sage, and this is Easy English with Sage.
Let me ask you something honest. You've been studying English for years, maybe decades. You understand grammar. You can read articles, follow conversations, watch films without subtitles. And yet, there are moments in a meeting when someone says something and you understand every single word, but somehow you feel one step behind. Moments when you want to say something precise, something intelligent, something that captures exactly what you mean, and instead, you reach for a simpler word, a safer word, a word that gets the job done but doesn't quite feel like you. That gap, that specific frustrating gap between knowing English and truly inhabiting it, that is exactly what we're working on today. Today's session is about advanced English phrases native speakers use daily. Not textbook language, not academic vocabulary from a dictionary. Real phrases, living language, the expressions that educated, fluent speakers reach for naturally, without thinking, in offices and conversations and serious discussions every single day. By the end of this session, you won't just have heard these phrases. You'll have practiced them. You'll have put them in your mouth and felt how they move. You'll have placed them in real situations and understood exactly when and why a native speaker would choose them. If your goal is to sound confident and natural in advanced English, not just functional, but genuinely fluent, then this channel was made for you. Subscribe now if you haven't already. Every single day, we're here doing exactly this kind of deep, serious, immersive work together. Now, let's talk about something important before we begin. Most English learners, even advanced ones, have what I call a vocabulary ceiling. It's invisible. You don't always notice it's there, but it shows up in small ways. You use the same 5 or 6 phrases to express agreement, even when you mean different shades of agreement. You describe something as interesting when you actually mean fascinating, or puzzling, or thought-provoking, or counterintuitive. You say a colleague did a good job when what you really want to say is that their work was remarkably thorough, or that they handled the situation with real finesse. The ceiling isn't about intelligence. It has nothing to do with your ability to think. It's simply about range. Native speakers have a wider range of expression available to them, and they use it constantly, without effort, because they've heard and used these phrases thousands of times. Today, we're going to start giving you that range. But here's the thing I want you to hold on to throughout this session. The goal is not to impress people. The goal is precision. When you have the right phrase for the right moment, you stop losing things in translation. You stop that invisible pause where you're mentally searching for a word. You start to sound like someone who thinks in English, because in a very real way, you will be. Take a breath. Settle in. This is going to take some time, and that's exactly the point. We're not rushing today. We're building something. Let's begin. The first phrase I want to give you is one that native speakers use constantly in professional and intellectual conversation, and yet it almost never appears in standard English courses. The phrase is, that said. Say it with me. That said. Say it once more. That said. Good. Now let me explain what it does, because this phrase is remarkably useful. That said is a pivot phrase. It allows you to acknowledge what came before and then introduce a contrasting or qualifying idea. It signals to your listener, I'm not dismissing what was just said, but there's another layer to consider. Here's an example. Imagine you're in a meeting and someone has just presented a solid plan. You want to acknowledge that it's solid, but you also see a problem. You could say, it's a well-structured proposal. That said, I'm not sure the timeline is realistic given our current resources. Do you hear that? You're not being dismissive. You're not being harsh. You're being precise. You're thinking out loud in a way that is professionally calibrated. Let's try another. The report is comprehensive and well-researched. That said, a few of the conclusions could benefit from more supporting data. Repeat after me. The report is comprehensive and well-researched. That said, a few of the conclusions could benefit from more supporting data. Good. Again, it's an interesting perspective. That said, I think there are aspects we haven't fully explored yet. This phrase, that said, signals intellectual honesty. It shows that you can hold two ideas at once, that you're not simply agreeing or disagreeing, but thinking carefully. When you use it naturally, you sound measured. You sound like someone worth listening to. Now let's say it flows easily. That said, let the phrase become comfortable in your mouth. The way a native speaker uses it, there's no stress on any particular word. It's smooth. It's confident. That said, keep that one. Let it sit. We'll come back to it. Our second phrase is, I'd be inclined to. Say it with me. I'd be inclined to. I'd be inclined to. This phrase is elegant. It expresses a preference or a tendency without being absolute or aggressive about it. When you say, I think we should do X, that's direct. It's fine. But when you say, I'd be inclined to take a more cautious approach here, you're expressing the same preference with more sophistication. You're inviting discussion rather than shutting it down. You're showing that you've considered the matter and have a leaning, but you're remaining open. This is how senior professionals speak. This is how people in meetings who are taken seriously express themselves. Not always with certainty, but with considered opinion. Let's practice. Repeat after me. I'd be inclined to wait before making a final decision. Again, I'd be inclined to wait before making a final decision. Good. One more. Given what we know so far, I'd be inclined to recommend the second option. Notice the structure. You can put a context clause before it. Given what we know, or based on the feedback we've received, or considering the risks, and then I'd be inclined to. It sounds thoughtful. It sounds careful. It sounds like someone who weighs their words before they speak. Try it yourself. Think of something at work, a decision, a recommendation, a judgment, and frame it with this phrase. Say it out loud, right now. I'd be inclined to. Good. That phrase belongs to you now. Let's move to the third phrase. It's worth noting that. Say it. It's worth noting that. Again, it's worth noting that. This phrase is a professional's best friend. It allows you to introduce a piece of information, a fact, a caveat, an observation, in a way that signals importance without alarm. You're not saying, this is a massive problem. You're not saying, nobody has mentioned this and they should have. You're saying, here is something that deserves attention. Quietly, professionally, precisely. For example, the project is largely on track. It's worth noting that the software integration phase has taken longer than anticipated. Or, the candidate has strong qualifications. It's worth noting that she has no direct experience in our industry. Or, our sales figures have improved significantly this quarter. It's worth noting that this growth is concentrated in one region. In each of those sentences, the phrase, it's worth noting, does something subtle but powerful. It draws attention to a detail that might otherwise be glossed over. And it does so without drama. It's the phrase of a careful thinker, someone who notices things and brings them to the surface calmly. Repeat with me. The data is largely positive. It's worth noting that we're working with a relatively small sample size. Once more, it's worth noting that we haven't yet heard back from all stakeholders. Let that phrase settle into you. It's worth noting that. Clean, useful, mature. If you're still with me, I want to ask you something. Have you ever known the information, known exactly what you wanted to say, but you couldn't find the right frame for it? That's exactly what phrases like these provide. Not the content, the container. The structure that holds your ideas and presents them the way they deserve to be presented. If this is already helping you, type something in the comment. Tell me which phrase feels most useful to you so far. I'll be watching. Let's continue. Phrase 4. There's something to be said for. Say it. There's something to be said for. There's something to be said for. This phrase acknowledges merit in an idea, approach, or position without necessarily committing to it fully. It's a way of being intellectually generous, of recognizing that things are rarely simple. For example, there's something to be said for a more traditional approach. It's proven and the risks are lower. Or, I know some people find this method inefficient, but honestly, there's something to be said for taking your time and getting it right. Or, there's something to be said for working under pressure. Some people genuinely do their best thinking when a deadline is close. This phrase shows nuance. It shows that you don't dismiss things simply because they're old or simple or unfashionable. You think, you weigh, you recognize what's true. There's something to be said for consistency over intensity. Good. Again, there's something to be said for admitting when you don't know the answer. Now you try. Complete this sentence. There's something to be said for, and finish it with something you genuinely believe. Say it out loud. Good. That's yours. That's real language use. That's what it means to think in English. Now, I want to briefly pause on something because I think it's important to name it. We're about 20 minutes into this session, and we've covered 4 phrases. Some of you may feel like that's slow. And I want to gently push back on that instinct, because that instinct, the urge to get through more faster, is actually one of the things that holds advanced learners back. You don't need more phrases. You need fewer phrases, owned deeply. The difference between someone who has heard 500 phrases and someone who has genuinely internalized 50 phrases is enormous. And the second person sounds dramatically more fluent. So we're going to keep this pace. We're going to stay with each phrase long enough that it starts to feel like yours. Let's continue. Phrase 5. On reflection. Say it. On reflection. On reflection. This phrase signals that you've thought about something carefully, that you've considered it over time and are now offering a considered opinion. It's the opposite of a knee-jerk reaction. It's the opposite of impulsive. When you begin a sentence with on reflection, you immediately signal to your listener, this is a measured, deliberate thought. On reflection, I think we should have involved the team earlier in the process. On reflection, I'm not sure my initial reading of the situation was accurate. On reflection, it's probably better to address this directly rather than let it continue. Notice that on reflection often comes with a degree of self-correction or refined judgment. It shows intellectual honesty. It shows that you're willing to look at a situation again, update your thinking, and say so clearly. Repeat after me. On reflection, I think the proposal needs more development before we present it. Again, on reflection, I may have been too hasty in dismissing that idea. This phrase also has a useful cousin, on further reflection, which implies an even more extended period of thought. On further reflection, I think the original strategy was actually sound. We just didn't execute it properly. Say that with me. On further reflection. Good. Keep that one as well. Phrase 6. I take your point, but. Say it. I take your point, but. I take your point, but. This phrase is one of the most useful you will ever learn for professional disagreement. It is respectful. It is clear. It is not aggressive, and it is not passive. It says, I hear you. I understand what you're saying. I am not dismissing it. And here is my different view. It's vastly superior to yes, but, which can sound dismissive. It's different from I understand, however, which can sound slightly cold. I take your point, but is warm and firm at the same time. It acknowledges intelligence on the other side of the conversation without surrendering your own. Let's practice. Repeat after me. I take your point, but I think we're underestimating how long this will take. Again, I take your point, but there are some risks here that I don't think we've fully accounted for. One more. I take your point, and it's a fair one, but the evidence doesn't quite support that conclusion. Notice that last version. I take your point, and it's a fair one, but that acknowledgement in the middle, and it's a fair one, deepens the respect. It says, I genuinely recognize what you've said as valid. My disagreement is not a dismissal. That phrase within a phrase is a mark of real conversational sophistication. Try it now. Think of someone you might need to disagree with, a colleague, a manager, even a friend. Practice saying, I take your point, but. Say it out loud. Don't just read it. Say it. Excellent. That phrase, used consistently, will change how people experience you in conversation. You will be known as someone who listens, engages, and disagrees thoughtfully. That is not a small thing. Let's keep going. Phrase 7, to put it another way. Say it. To put it another way. To put it another way. This phrase is a reformulation signal. It tells your listener, I'm about to say the same thing differently. I want to make sure this lands clearly. It's what you reach for when you sense that what you just said might not have been understood. Or when you want to offer a simpler, more direct version of a complex idea. It shows intellectual flexibility. It shows that you can move between levels of language, that you can explain an idea both precisely and plainly, depending on what the moment requires. The methodology has some structural limitations. To put it another way the study was designed may not allow us to draw the conclusions we're hoping for. There are compounding dependencies that create risk. To put it another way, if one thing goes wrong, it could affect everything else in the chain. The feedback was mixed. To put it another way, people liked the concept, but weren't sure about the execution. Repeat after me. The situation is complex. To put it another way, there's no simple fix here. Good. Again. To put it another way, we're being asked to do more with less. Now, here's the thing about this phrase. It's not just useful when you think someone didn't understand you. It's also useful when you want to add a second layer to an idea you've just introduced. Native speakers use it to deepen a point, not just clarify it. To put it another way, invites the listener to hear the same idea from a different angle. And often, the second version lands more powerfully than the first. Think of it as a thinking tool, a way of turning an idea over and looking at it from another side. Phrase 8, as things stand. Say it, as things stand. As things stand. This phrase describes the current state of the situation, with a quiet implication that this state might change. It's a phrase for moments of uncertainty, transition, or ongoing development. It's honest without being alarming. As things stand, we're unlikely to meet the original deadline. As things stand, the best option seems to be the one we discussed last week. As things stand, I don't have enough information to make a recommendation. What I love about this phrase is its precision. It doesn't say forever. It doesn't say certainly. It says right now in this moment. Based on what we currently know, this is the picture. It leaves room for things to change, which is intellectually honest because things often do change. Repeat after me. As things stand, the project is about 3 weeks behind schedule. Again, as things stand, I'm cautiously optimistic about the outcome. Good. This phrase is particularly powerful in professional writing as well, in emails, reports, and summaries. As things stand, we anticipate completion by the end of the quarter. It's clean, precise, and clear. Let me say something here, because we're now about 40 minutes into this session. I want you to notice something. Have you been speaking these phrases aloud? Or have you been listening passively, telling yourself you'll practice later? There is no later. There is only now. Go back. Pick any phrase we've covered, say it out loud 3 times, right now, before we continue. Your brain learns differently when your mouth moves, when you produce the sound, not just receive it. This is not a metaphor. It's cognitive science. The physical act of speaking activates a different kind of memory than simply reading or hearing. Say it. Any one of them. Go. Good. Let's continue. Phrase 9. I'd argue that. Say it. I'd argue that. I'd argue that. This phrase presents your opinion with confidence, but also with an acknowledgement that it is an opinion, not a law of nature. It shows intellectual courage. You're not hiding behind vague language. You're stepping forward and saying, here is what I think, and I'm willing to defend it. But you're framing it as argument, not decree. You're inviting engagement rather than ending discussion. I'd argue that the real problem isn't the strategy, it's the implementation. I'd argue that we've been too conservative in our approach and that a bolder move is warranted. I'd argue that the most important factor here is trust, not efficiency. There's something authoritative about this phrase, but it's an authority that earns respect rather than demanding it. It says, I've thought about this. I have a position, and I'm willing to have that position challenged because I'm confident in the reasoning behind it. Repeat after me. I'd argue that consistency matters more than intensity when learning a language. Again, I'd argue that the benefits of this approach outweigh the risks. Notice how this phrase also works in everyday conversation, not just professional settings. I'd argue that the second season was actually better than the first. I'd argue that cooking at home is worth the extra time. It's versatile, it's natural, and it elevates any conversation it enters. Phrase 10. There's a case to be made for. Say it. There's a case to be made. There's a case to be made for. This phrase is the intellectual's version of maybe this could work. It presents an argument without fully committing to it. You're acknowledging that a position has merit, that if someone wanted to argue for it, they could find legitimate grounds, without necessarily saying that you personally hold that position. There's a case to be made for a slower, more deliberate rollout. The risks of moving too fast are real. There's a case to be made for keeping the team smaller, at least in the early stages. There's a case to be made for taking no action at all and simply watching how the situation develops. This phrase is particularly useful when you're in a discussion where multiple positions have validity. It allows you to explore an argument without declaring allegiance to it. It shows open-mindedness. It shows that you can hold ideas at arm's length and examine them before deciding. Repeat after me. There's a case to be made for delaying the launch until we have more data. Good. Again. There's a case to be made for both approaches. The real question is what we're optimizing for. Now try it yourself. Think of a situation at work or in your personal life where multiple options exist. Start your sentence with, there's a case to be made for, and finish it. Say it out loud. That's advanced thinking expressed in advanced English. That's what we're building today. Let's pause here and go back through the first 10 phrases, not to repeat them all, but to remind you what they do, because this is important. These aren't random expressions. They're tools, and each one does a specific job. That said, pivots to a contrasting idea while honoring what came before. I'd be inclined to expresses a considered preference without aggression. It's worth noting that draws professional attention to an important detail. There's something to be said for acknowledges merit in a position with intellectual generosity. On reflection, signals deliberate, considered thought. I take your point, but disagrees respectfully and firmly. To put it another way, reformulates an idea for clarity or depth. As things stand, describes a current state with honest uncertainty. I'd argue that presents an opinion with confident intellectual courage. There's a case to be made for, explores an argument without committing to it. Do you see the pattern? These are the phrases of a careful, intelligent communicator. Someone who thinks before they speak. Someone who can be precise and nuanced at the same time. Someone who engages with ideas rather than just relaying information. If you're watching this and thinking, this is harder than the English I usually practice, you're right. This is harder. This is C1 and C2 level expression. And the fact that it's challenging means you're exactly where you should be. Comfortable learning is slow learning. The slight stretch you feel right now, that's growth. Let's continue. Phrase 11. At this juncture. Say it. At this juncture. At this juncture. This phrase means at this point in time, or at this stage in the process. But it does something that at this point doesn't quite do. It implies that we're at a significant moment. A moment where a decision or shift is possible, or even necessary. It's a phrase for turning points. At this juncture, I think we need to be very clear about our priorities. At this juncture, it would be premature to draw firm conclusions. At this juncture, the most important thing is to maintain alignment across the team. You hear this phrase in boardrooms, in policy discussions, in serious conversations between people who understand that where they are in the process matters. It's weighty without being heavy. Repeat after me. At this juncture, I think it's wise to take stock of where we are. Again, at this juncture, moving forward without full information would be a significant risk. Good. That phrase carries authority. Use it when you're in a serious conversation and you want to signal that you understand the gravity of the moment. Phrase 12. It remains to be seen whether. Say it. It remains to be seen whether. It remains to be seen whether. This phrase acknowledges uncertainty about the future. It says, we don't know yet. And it says this with precision and intellectual honesty, rather than false certainty in either direction. The strategy is sound in theory. It remains to be seen whether the team can execute it effectively. The proposal has promise. It remains to be seen whether the costs can be managed within budget. It remains to be seen whether the new system will actually reduce the time spent on administrative tasks. What I appreciate about this phrase is that it refuses to pretend. So many conversations, especially professional ones, are dominated by false confidence. People predict outcomes as if the future were already settled. It remains to be seen whether is the honest alternative. It says, we hope, we plan, we aim, but we don't know for certain. And anyone who tells you they do is not being entirely truthful. Repeat. It remains to be seen whether the changes will produce the expected results. Again, it remains to be seen whether this is a temporary challenge or something more fundamental. Good. That phrase marks you as someone who is honest about complexity. That's rare. That's respected. Phrase 13. In hindsight. Say it. In hindsight. In hindsight. Hindsight refers to understanding a situation only after it has already occurred. In hindsight is the phrase you use when you're looking back and recognizing something you couldn't see clearly in the moment. It's a phrase for wisdom, for learning, for honest self-assessment. In hindsight, We should have started that conversation much earlier. In hindsight, the warning signs were there. We simply weren't looking for them. In hindsight, the decision to expand so quickly was probably premature. This phrase is powerful because it demonstrates humility combined with intelligence. You're not blaming yourself or others. You're not making excuses. You're simply naming what you now understand more clearly, and implicitly you're signaling that you've learned from it. Repeat after me. In hindsight, a different approach would have been more effective. Good. Again. In hindsight, I wish we'd taken more time to consult the team before deciding. Now try it yourself. Think of something in your own life, professionally or personally, where you can see something now that wasn't clear at the time. Start your sentence with "in hindsight" and complete it. This is not just English practice. This is reflective thinking in English. This is what fluency actually feels like, when the language becomes a vehicle for your real thoughts, not just a set of rehearsed sentences. Phrase 14. The implications are significant. Say it. The implications are significant. The implications are significant. This phrase signals that what you're about to say, or what was just said, has consequences that extend beyond the immediate situation. It's the phrase of a strategic thinker, someone who looks at a fact or decision and immediately starts asking, what does this mean? What follows from this? What will change? The results of this study are interesting, but what's more important is that the implications are significant for how we think about the whole approach. If we change the pricing structure, the implications are significant for our relationship with existing clients. The implications are significant enough that I think we need to bring this to senior leadership before we go any further. If the data holds, the implications are significant for the entire sector. The implications are significant, and I don't think we've fully worked through them yet. This phrase elevates any analysis you're doing. It says, I'm not just describing what happened, I'm thinking about what it means. To a large extent, the success of the project depended on the quality of communication within the team. To a large extent, how fluent you become depends on how consistently you practice. The outcome was positive, to a large extent, because of the groundwork that had been laid in the previous months. To a large extent, this is a question of trust. To a large extent, the challenges we're facing are self-created and therefore self-solvable. This phrase matters because it prevents overgeneralization. Smart people qualify their statements. They don't say always when they mean usually. They don't say completely when they mean significantly. To a large extent is the phrase of someone who understands that truth is often partial. Let's take a moment. We're now about a third of the way through our session. I want to check in with you. Are you still saying these phrases aloud? Are you creating your own sentences? Not just echoing mine, but actually placing these phrases into your own professional life, your own reality. Because here's something important. You could listen to this entire session passively and feel good at the end. Warm, informed, like you've done something useful. And you will have done something useful, but you will retain a fraction of what you'd retain if you speak. If you pause, if you think, where would I use this? Who would I say this to? What would I be saying it about? Fluency is not a spectator activity. If you're serious about this, and I think you are because you're still here, pause the video right now. Take any 3 phrases from what we've covered, write them down, speak them in sentences from your own life. Then come back. I'll wait. Ready? Let's continue. Phrase 16. I'm not in a position to. Say it. I'm not in a position to. I'm not in a position to. I'm not in a position to. This phrase declines or limits a commitment, but does so with professionalism and without negativity. It's not I can't or I won't. It's I'm not in a position to, which implies that the limitation is situational, not personal. It's more measured, more mature. I'm not in a position to make a commitment on that without speaking with my team first. I'm not in a position to comment on something I haven't had the chance to review thoroughly. At this stage, I'm not in a position to give you a firm timeline. Repeat. I'm not in a position to approve that request without more information. Again, I'm not in a position to speak to the technical side. That would be a question for the engineering team. This phrase is invaluable in professional life. It sets limits without creating tension. It says, I'm being careful, not obstructive. I'm being honest, not difficult. It's the phrase of someone who knows the difference between what they can offer and what they can't, and communicates that difference clearly. Phrase 17. That's a fair point. Say it. That's a fair point. Simple, direct, and deeply effective. When someone says something you genuinely agree with, or even partially agree with, that's a fair point, is a phrase that creates connection without undermining your own position. It doesn't mean you're completely right and I surrender. It means you've said something that deserves acknowledgement. That's not nothing. That's a fair point. I hadn't considered the impact on the smaller team. That's a fair point, and it's something we should address before moving forward. That's a fair point, though I still think the benefits outweigh the risks. Notice that last version. That's a fair point, though I still think. You can acknowledge a good argument and still maintain your own. This is sophisticated disagreement. This is the kind of conversation that moves things forward. Repeat after me. That's a fair point. Let me think about how we might address it. Again, that's a fair point, and I appreciate you raising it. Use this phrase generously in discussions, not as flattery, but as genuine intellectual acknowledgement. People respond to it. It creates an atmosphere where good thinking is recognized and rewarded. And when you use it, you become someone who enables better conversations, not just someone who participates in them. Phrase 18. I want to be clear about something. Say it. I want to be clear about something. I want to be clear about something. This phrase is a signal. It tells the people in the conversation, pay attention. Something important is about to be stated. It's the phrase you use when you want to ensure that what you're about to say is not misunderstood, not minimized, and not forgotten. I want to be clear about something. This is not a criticism of the team. It's a structural question. I want to be clear about something. We're not making this decision today. This is a conversation, not a conclusion. This decision affects everyone in this room. Good. Again, I want to be clear about something. My support for the plan is conditional on the budget being approved. This phrase establishes authority without aggression. It says, I'm speaking now, and what I'm saying matters. Listen carefully. It's the phrase of someone who takes their own words seriously and invites others to do the same. Phrase 19. The distinction is subtle but important. Say it. The distinction is subtle but important. The distinction is subtle but important. This one. This phrase is for moments when two things look similar but aren't. When someone might be tempted to treat two ideas as equivalent, but they're not. It's the phrase of a precise thinker, someone who pays attention to the details that other people miss. There's a distinction between being direct and being blunt. We're talking about reducing costs, not reducing quality. The distinction is subtle, but important. Confidence and certainty are not the same thing. The distinction is subtle, but important. There's a distinction between what's urgent and what's important. The distinction is subtle, but important. Again, the distinction is subtle, but important, and getting it wrong could lead us in the wrong direction. This phrase shows that you think carefully, that you don't collapse complexity, that you can hold two things close together and still see the space between them. That's rare. That's impressive. That's a mark of a genuinely educated mind. Let's take a moment and practice flowing through several of these phrases together in a kind of connected monologue. I'll model it first, and then I'd like you to create something similar. Here's what it might sound like to use several of these phrases together in a professional context. To a large extent, I think the challenges we're facing are structural rather than individual. That said, I want to be clear about something. I'm not suggesting that people haven't been working hard. They have. On reflection, though, I'd argue that the process itself needs to be redesigned. The implications are significant, which is why I think we need to address this carefully rather than rushing to a solution. There's a case to be made for taking a full month to analyze the situation before proposing any changes. As things stand, I'd be inclined to recommend exactly that. Say that with me. Or better, construct your own version. Pick a situation from your own professional life and speak for 30 to 60 seconds using as many of these phrases as you naturally can. Don't force them, but let them guide you. Go ahead, speak. Not individual phrases memorized in isolation, but ideas flowing, connected by sophisticated language, expressing real thinking in real time. That's the goal, and you're working toward it right now. Let's continue with our next set of phrases. Phrase 20. It's not entirely clear. Say it. It's not entirely clear. It's not entirely clear. This phrase admits uncertainty without admitting ignorance. There's an important distinction there. Saying I don't know is fine, but it's complete. It closes the door. It's not entirely clear says the situation has ambiguity in it. There are layers we haven't yet resolved. It's an honest assessment that keeps the conversation open. It's not entirely clear what the long-term consequences of this decision will be. It's not entirely clear whether the new guidelines apply in this specific case. It's not entirely clear from the data which factor is driving the change. It's not entirely clear whether the approach will scale. Again, it's not entirely clear what the client actually wants. And I think we need to ask directly. Good. This phrase is also useful because it gently signals to others in a conversation, we need more information before we can proceed with confidence. It's not an obstacle. It's an invitation to dig deeper. Phrase 21. All things considered. Say it. All things considered. All things considered. This phrase signals that you've weighed multiple factors and are now offering a balanced overall judgment. It's a summation phrase, a phrase that says, I've looked at this from several angles, and here is what I conclude when I take everything into account. All things considered, I think the decision we made was the right one, given what we knew at the time. All things considered, the project was a success, even though there were some challenging moments along the way. All things considered. I think the best course of action at this point is to proceed with caution. All things considered, the team handled a difficult situation remarkably well. All things considered, I'm cautiously optimistic about the direction we're heading. All things considered creates the impression that you have perspective, that you're not reacting to one element of the situation in isolation, that you've looked at the whole picture and formed a measured view. That quality, measured perspective, is something that people in professional settings notice and value. For all intents and purposes, for all intents and purposes, for all intents and purposes, this phrase means in every practical or meaningful sense, in effect. For all practical considerations, It's the phrase you use when something is true in every way that actually matters, even if there are theoretical exceptions that don't really apply. For all intents and purposes, the deal is done. We're just waiting on the formal paperwork. For all intents and purposes, this team is running independently now. For all intents and purposes, the previous strategy has been abandoned. Repeat. For all intents and purposes, the project is complete. Good. Again. For all intents and purposes, we're starting from scratch. This phrase is common in professional spoken English, more common in conversation than in writing, actually. When you use it naturally, you sound like someone who has been living and working in English for a long time. That's not nothing. Phrase 23. To be frank with you. Say it. To be frank with you. To be frank with you. This phrase prepares your listener for an honest statement, possibly one that's more direct or candid than usual. It's a courtesy, a signal that says, I respect you enough to tell you what I actually think, rather than what you want to hear. To be frank with you, I'm not convinced this is the right direction, and here's why. The courage to be frank, to say what you actually think with care and clarity, is something that distinguishes effective communicators from everyone else. This phrase frames that frankness in a way that is respectful rather than blunt. It says, I'm being direct because I trust this conversation, not because I'm being careless with your feelings. In practice, this is one of the most useful two-word phrases in advanced English. It distinguishes between how things work in theory, on paper, in principle, and how they actually work in reality. Very often, those two things are different. In practice is the honest bridge between them. In principle, the system makes sense. In practice, it creates more work than it saves. The policy is clear on paper. In practice, it's almost impossible to enforce. In theory, the two teams should collaborate smoothly. In practice, there are significant communication gaps. Repeat after me. It sounds simple. In practice, it requires a great deal of coordination. Again, the guidelines are well-intentioned. In practice, they don't account for the complexity of real situations. The phrase in practice earns respect because it shows that you understand the gap between intention and reality. It shows that you've been paying attention to how things actually unfold, not just how they're supposed to unfold. That's experience. That's insight. That's the quality of thinking that makes people listen when you speak. We're now more than halfway through this session. I want to say something. If you started this video tired or distracted or with one eye on something else, and you're still here, I want to acknowledge that, not with excessive praise, but with a simple recognition. This kind of sustained, deep practice is exactly what separates people who make real progress from people who learn a lot of English but never quite sound fluent. The difference is rarely intelligence. It's almost never talent. The difference is this: the willingness to stay in the lesson when it gets difficult, to stay in the practice when it gets uncomfortable, to stay in the language when it would be easier to retreat back to your first language. You're staying. That matters. Let's continue. Phrase 25. That's not entirely accurate. That's not entirely accurate. That's not entirely accurate. This phrase corrects a misstatement without being combative, dismissive, or rude. It's the professional's way of saying, that's not quite right. It doesn't accuse anyone of lying. It doesn't make anyone feel foolish. It simply introduces a correction, calmly, clearly, with precision. I've seen this framed as a budget issue. That's not entirely accurate. The real challenge is timeline, not budget. There's a perception in the market that our product lacks features. That's not entirely accurate. There are specific areas where we're genuinely ahead. That's not entirely accurate. The report was submitted on time, but the review process took longer than expected. Repeat. That's not entirely accurate. The situation is more nuanced than that. Again, that's not entirely accurate, and I think it's worth clarifying. This phrase is respectful. It's also firm. It doesn't let errors stand unchallenged, which is sometimes the professionally responsible thing to do. In a world where how you say something matters as much as what you say, that's not entirely accurate is the phrase that lets you correct without conflict. Phrase 26. I would venture to say. Say it. I would venture to say. I would venture to say. Venture here means to risk, to put forward something uncertain. When you say, I would venture to say, you're offering an opinion or claim that you believe to be true, but that you acknowledge as a judgment rather than a fact. It's confident without being overconfident. It invites disagreement while still asserting a view. I would venture to say that the majority of the challenges we're facing are organizational rather than strategic. I would venture to say that if we address the communication issues, the performance issues will largely take care of themselves. I would venture to say this is one of the more significant decisions we'll make this year. I would venture to say that we're further along than we think. Again, I would venture to say the hesitation we're seeing is about trust, not process. This phrase feels considered, thoughtful, like the speaker has genuine substance behind their words. Use it when you want to offer a perspective that is meaningful, not casual, not flippant, but genuinely considered. It elevates the moment. Phrase 27. Broadly speaking. Say it. Broadly speaking. It signals that what you're about to say is a general pattern, a rough approximation, a summary that may not capture every detail, but captures the essential shape of things. It's the honest counterpart to specificity. Broadly speaking, the feedback has been positive. Broadly speaking, the two approaches lead to similar outcomes, though the details differ significantly. Broadly speaking, the problem comes down to a lack of clear ownership. Repeat. Broadly speaking, this is a question of resources, not capability. Good. Again. Broadly speaking, the team is aligned. There are just a few points of tension that need to be resolved. Broadly speaking is honest about the limits of generalization. It says, I'm giving you the overview, not the full picture. The full picture is more complex, and I know it. But for the purposes of this conversation, here is the general shape. That kind of intellectual transparency is appreciated by anyone who takes ideas seriously. Phrase 28. I'd stop short of saying. Say it. I'd stop short of saying. I'd stop short of saying. This phrase indicates that something almost reaches a conclusion, but not quite. You're drawing a limit. You're saying, yes, things are pointing in that direction, but I'm not willing to go all the way there. It's a phrase of precision and restraint. I'd stop short of saying the project is in crisis, but I do think we need a serious reassessment. I'd stop short of saying it was a failure. There were meaningful learnings and some real successes. I'd stop short of saying the relationship is irreparable, but it will take significant effort to rebuild. I'd stop short of saying it's the wrong decision. I just think it's premature. Again, I'd stop short of saying the situation is dire, but it does require urgent attention. This phrase shows that your thinking doesn't fall into easy categories. You don't rush to conclusions. You draw careful lines around what you're actually claiming. That kind of calibration is a mark of intellectual maturity. Phrase 29. The core issue here is. Say it. The core issue here is. The core issue here is. This phrase cuts through noise. It says, all of these other things are present and they matter. But if we're really honest, Here is the central problem. The one thing that is addressed would change everything. There are many factors at play, but the core issue here is accountability, or the lack of it. We've been discussing symptoms. The core issue here is that the system isn't designed to support the current volume of work. The core issue here is that we haven't had an honest conversation about what we're actually trying to achieve. Repeat. The core issue here is trust. Until that's addressed, everything else is secondary. Again, I think the core issue here is that we're optimizing for the wrong thing. This phrase demonstrates clear thinking. The ability to identify a central problem rather than getting lost in peripheral detail is one of the most valued cognitive skills in professional life. The core issue here says that you have that ability. Use it when you genuinely do see it clearly, and it will carry real weight. Phrase 30. I think that's worth exploring. I think that's worth exploring. And we end this section with a phrase that opens doors rather than closing them. When someone has introduced an idea that may have merit, even if you're not sure yet, even if it needs development, I think that's worth exploring, gives it space to grow. It says, let's not dismiss this. Let's see where it leads. It's an unconventional approach, but I think that's worth exploring. The idea may seem radical at first. I think that's worth exploring because the current approach clearly isn't working. That's an interesting observation. I think that's worth exploring in more depth. Repeat after me. I'm not certain it's the answer, but I think that's worth exploring. Again, that raises some important questions. I think that's worth exploring further. This phrase creates an atmosphere of intellectual curiosity. It says, good ideas can come from unexpected places. No suggestion is dismissed simply because it doesn't fit the expected pattern. It builds trust. It makes the people around you feel that their thinking is valued. At this point in our session, I want to do something a little different. I want to bring these phrases to life together in a kind of extended practice scenario. I'll describe a professional situation, and then I want you to speak, to answer, to respond using the language we've been building today. Here's the scenario. You're in a project review meeting. Your manager has just said, I think the project is basically on track and we should continue with the current plan. You disagree, but you want to be constructive. You see some real issues that need to be addressed. How do you respond? Here's one possible answer. Say it with me. I take your point, and broadly speaking, I think we're moving in the right direction. That said, I'd stop short of saying the project is fully on track. There are a few things worth noting, particularly around the timeline and some unresolved dependencies. I'd argue that the core issue here is that we haven't yet confirmed some key decisions that the next phase depends on. I'm not in a position to say this will definitely cause problems, but the implications are significant enough that I think it's worth exploring before we commit to the current plan. I'd like to draw attention to. This phrase is a professional spotlight. It says, in this conversation, this is what matters. This is what I think deserves focused consideration. It's assertive without being aggressive. And it's the phrase you use when you want to ensure something important isn't overlooked. I'd like to draw attention to the fact that we've had this same conversation 3 times without reaching a resolution. I'd like to draw attention to the progress we've made in the last 2 weeks. It's been significant. I'd like to draw attention to a detail in the proposal that I think could cause complications further down the line. I'd like to draw attention to the resource constraints that may affect delivery. Before we move on, I'd like to draw attention to an assumption we seem to be making that may not be valid. Good. This phrase is particularly powerful in written communication as well. in emails and reports where you want something noticed. I'd like to draw attention to, followed by something specific and clearly stated, is how professionals ensure critical information is not buried. That raises an important question. That raises an important question. That raises an important question. This is a transition phrase. You use it to redirect a conversation toward a deeper or more fundamental issue that has just been implied by something that was said. It shows that you're not just listening to the surface of the conversation. You're tracking the deeper implications. That raises an important question about whether our current infrastructure can actually support this kind of growth. That raises an important question. If we accept this in principle, what else are we committed to by implication? That raises an important question about accountability. Who exactly is responsible for this outcome? Repeat after me. That raises an important question about priorities. Again, that's a good point, but that raises an important question I think we need to answer first. Use this phrase when you sense that the conversation is moving in a direction without examining its full implications. It slows the pace, constructively, and ensures that important questions are asked before decisions are made. Phrase 33. I think it's premature to. Say it. I think it's premature to. I think it's premature to. Premature means too early, before the right time. When you say, I think it's premature to, you're saying, not yet. We don't have enough information. We haven't done enough groundwork. Moving now would be moving too fast. I think it's premature to make a final decision without hearing from all the affected parties. I think it's premature to celebrate. We haven't yet confirmed the results. I think it's premature to rule out the alternative. We haven't fully assessed it. Repeat. I think it's premature to close this conversation. There are still open questions. Good. Again, I understand the urgency, but I think it's premature to see. This phrase is professionally valuable because it allows you to slow things down without blocking progress. You're not saying, don't do this. You're saying, not yet. Not until we've done this thoughtfully. That distinction is important. Phrase 34. It's difficult to overstate. Say it. It's difficult to overstate. It's difficult to overstate. This phrase means the importance of this is very hard to exaggerate. Even if you tried to emphasize it too much, you probably still wouldn't capture how significant it is. It's the phrase of genuine emphasis, used sparingly, because when you use it, people know you mean it. It's difficult to overstate how much this decision will affect the direction of the team. It's difficult to overstate the importance of communication in a transition like this. It's difficult to overstate how significant this shift in the market actually is. Repeat. It's difficult to overstate how critical the next few weeks will be. Again. It's difficult to overstate the role that trust plays in a situation like this. Be careful with this phrase. Use it only when you genuinely believe it, because the people who use it most effectively are the ones who use it rarely. When you say it and you mean it, people listen differently. Phrase 35. The evidence suggests. Say it. The evidence suggests. The evidence suggests. This phrase introduces a claim that is grounded in data, observation, or facts. It's careful without being weak. It distinguishes between what you think, what you feel, and what the facts point toward. It's the language of a disciplined thinker. The evidence suggests that the changes we made in the first quarter are starting to produce results. The evidence suggests that the problem began before any of us were aware of it. The evidence suggests that this is a systematic issue, not an isolated one. Repeat. The evidence suggests that the approach is working, though it's still good. Again. The evidence suggests that our original timeline was unrealistically optimistic. This phrase positions you as someone who forms opinions based on evidence, not instinct alone, not politics, not wishful thinking. That's exactly the kind of credibility that's built over time through consistent use of careful, evidence-grounded language. Let's now take a different kind of practice moment. I want you to close your eyes or look away from the screen and try to recall as many phrases as you can from this session. Not a full sentence, just the phrase itself. Start with "that said" and move forward through what you remember. Take 30 seconds. Do this now. Go. How many did you remember? 6, 8, 12? Whatever the number, notice this. The ones you remember most easily are the ones you've been saying aloud. The ones that are still a little unclear are the ones that you mostly heard but didn't speak. This is not a coincidence. Your mouth is part of your memory. Speak the language. Don't just absorb it. Let's continue. Phrase 36. I'm inclined to agree, but. Say it. I'm inclined to agree, but. I'm inclined to agree, but. This phrase is the agreement version of I take your point, but. It says, my instinct is to align with you. And yet, there's something else here that I feel needs to be part of this conversation. I'm inclined to agree, but I'd want to see the data before I commit fully. I'm inclined to agree that this is the right direction, but I have some reservations about the timeline. I'm inclined to agree with the general approach, but the specific plan needs some adjustment. Repeat. I'm inclined to agree, but I think we're glossing over some real risks. Good. Again. I'm inclined to agree. That said, I think the objections raised earlier deserve more attention. This phrase is diplomatically sophisticated. You're not a yes person. You're not a no person. You're a careful thinker who listens, agrees where agreement is genuine, and draws attention to complexity where complexity exists. That is a quality that people rely on. Phrase 37. Let me be specific. Say it. Let me be specific. Let me be specific. This phrase signals a shift from the general to the particular. After a broader statement or discussion, let me be specific says, now I'm going to give you something concrete. A real example, a real number, a real situation. It's the phrase that demonstrates you're not just speaking in abstractions. We've been talking about communication problems in general terms. Let me be specific. Last week, the timeline change was communicated to 3 of the 5 teams, and the other 2 only found out by accident. There are several areas for improvement. Let me be specific. The first is the onboarding process. I've said the proposal needs work. Let me be specific about exactly what I mean. Let me be specific. Again, that's the general picture. Now let me be specific. This phrase marks you as a professional who can translate high-level analysis into concrete reality. That's one of the most valuable cognitive skills in any professional setting. Generals who can't specify, concepts that can't be illustrated, these are frustrating. Let me be specific fixes all of that. Phrase 38. I wouldn't go so far as to say. Say it. I wouldn't go so far as to say. I wouldn't go so far as to say. Similar to I'd stop short of saying, this phrase limits a conclusion that might seem to follow from the evidence, but that you feel is overstated. It maintains nuance. It prevents hyperbole. It keeps your thinking calibrated. The results are disappointing. I wouldn't go so far as to say the initiative failed, but it certainly didn't achieve what we hoped. There are challenges. I wouldn't go so far as to say the team is dysfunctional, but there are dynamics that need to be addressed. I wouldn't go so far as to say the strategy is wrong. I'd say it's incomplete. Repeat after me. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's been a success, but there are real reasons to be encouraged. Again, I wouldn't go so far as to say we've exhausted all options. There's still more we can explore. The willingness to stay in the gray, to resist the pull towards simple binary judgments, is a quality that separates serious thinkers from reactive ones. This phrase is the linguistic expression of that quality. Phrase 39, what concerns me is, what concerns me is, what concerns me is. This phrase introduces a worry or apprehension, but it does so with ownership and precision. You're not projecting the concern onto everyone. You're not saying this is a problem. You're saying, here is what I personally am concerned about. This is what is giving me pause. What concerns me is the pace. We're moving very quickly, and I'm not sure we've built in enough time for proper testing. What concerns me is that we haven't heard a clear response to the feedback that was raised last month. What concerns me is the precedent this might set if we proceed without proper consultation. What concerns me is not the decision itself, but the process by which we're arriving at it. Good, again. What concerns me is that the risks haven't been fully quantified. This phrase is honest, it's specific, and it's personal in a way that makes it harder to dismiss. When someone says there are concerns, it can feel abstract. When someone says, what concerns me is, they're taking responsibility for the concern. They're naming it. That carries weight. Phrase 40. It's a nuanced situation. Say it. It's a nuanced situation. It's a nuanced situation. And here, perhaps my favorite phrase of the entire session, because this phrase does something profound. It refuses simplicity when simplicity would be dishonest. It says, I understand that this is complex. I understand that there are multiple layers here. I am not going to pretend otherwise. It's a nuanced situation. There are valid arguments on both sides, and I don't think a simple decision is possible right now. It's a nuanced situation, and I think any response that ignores that complexity will create more problems than it solves. It's a nuanced situation, and I'd caution against making broad generalizations. Repeat after me. It's a nuanced situation, and I think we need to take the time to understand it fully. Again, I know we're under pressure to decide quickly, but it's a nuanced situation, and I think rushing could be costly. This phrase, in a world that often rewards speed and simplicity over depth and care, is an act of intellectual courage. It says, I will not pretend this is simple when it isn't. And in professional life, in serious conversations, in moments that matter, that honesty is not just appreciated, it's needed. We're entering the final portion of our session now, and I want to increase the pace slightly, not because we're rushing, but because fluency ultimately requires that these phrases flow, that they come quickly without significant search, that they're available to you in real time, not just in reflection. Let's practice some rapid use. I'll give you a phrase and you say it 3 times quickly before we move on. That said, say it 3 times now. That said, that said, that said. I'd be inclined to. 3 times. I'd be inclined to. I'd be inclined to. I'd be inclined to. On reflection. 3 times. On reflection. On reflection. On reflection. I take your point but. 3 times. I take your point but. I take your point but. I take your point but. The core issue here is. 3 times. The core issue here is. The core issue here is. It's not entirely clear. It's not entirely clear. It's not entirely clear. To be frank with you. To be frank with you. To be frank with you. In practice. In practice. In practice. It's a nuanced situation. It's a nuanced situation. It's a nuanced situation. Good. You're not just speaking words. You're building automatic pathways. Every time you say one of these phrases, you're reinforcing a neural route from thought to language. The more you do this, the shorter that route becomes, until eventually the route is instant. The phrase arrives when you need it, without searching. That's fluency. That's what we're building. Let's add some more phrases. Phrase 41. I take full responsibility for. Say it. I take full responsibility for. I take full responsibility for. I take full responsibility for. This is one of the most powerful phrases in professional communication and one of the most avoided. Because taking responsibility in a culture that often rewards blame shifting is uncomfortable. But the person who can look at a situation and say clearly, I take full responsibility for, without deflection, without qualification, without excuses, is a person who earns trust in a way that's almost impossible to manufacture any other way. I take full responsibility for the communication breakdown. It should have been clearer, and that was my oversight. I take full responsibility for the delay. I underestimated the complexity of the task and didn't ask for support early enough. I take full responsibility for bringing this decision forward without full consultation. That was an error in judgment. Repeat. I take full responsibility for the outcome, and here is what I plan to do differently going forward. Good. This phrase pairs beautifully with something actionable. Not just, I take full responsibility, but I take full responsibility, and here is my proposed path forward. That's accountability with direction. That's leadership. Phrase 42. What I'm hearing is. Say it. What I'm hearing is. This phrase is a listening phrase. It's what you use to reflect back what someone has said, to check your understanding, to ensure alignment, and to show the other person that you have genuinely processed what they said, rather than simply waiting for your turn to speak. What I'm hearing is that the timeline is the primary concern and the budget is secondary. What I'm hearing is that there are reservations about the approach, but that no one has a clear alternative. What I'm hearing is that the team feels undervalued and that the recognition piece needs to be addressed. Repeat. Just to make sure I understand, what I'm hearing is that you need more information before you can commit. Good. Again, what I'm hearing is that this is less about the decision itself and more about how it was made. This phrase is an act of respect. It says, I was listening. I want to make sure I understood correctly. I'm not assuming. I'm checking. In a professional world where people often talk past each other, this phrase creates genuine communication. That's rare, and it's remembered. Phrase 43. I want to push back on that slightly. Say it. I want to push back on that slightly. I want to push back on that slightly. Pushback means to resist or challenge. When you say, I want to push back on that slightly, you're disagreeing, but gently, with respect, with openness. The word slightly is important. It signals that this is not a full rejection. It's a nuanced disagreement, a refinement, a different angle on the same question. I want to push back on that slightly. I'm not sure the data supports that conclusion as directly as we're suggesting. I want to push back on that slightly. Not because I think you're wrong, but because I think there's something we're not fully accounting for. I want to push back on that slightly. The situation may be more complicated than that framing implies. Repeat after me. I want to push back on that slightly. I think we're oversimplifying. Good. Again, I want to push back on that slightly. I'd frame it differently. Disagreement done well is one of the highest level professional skills there is. This phrase gives you a way to do it, confidently, respectfully, and intelligently. Phrase 44. The way I see it. Say it. The way I'll see it. The way I see it. This phrase presents your perspective directly, without aggression, without qualification, without excessive hedging. It says, here is how I understand this situation. I'm not claiming my view is the only view, but this is the view I hold, and I'm comfortable saying so. The way I see it. The technical problem is actually a symptom of a deeper process issue. The way I see it, the best approach here is to be completely transparent with the client from the start. The way I see it, the question isn't whether we change, it's how quickly and how deliberately we do it. The way I see it, there are two choices, and neither is without risk. Good, again. The way I see it, this is an opportunity as much as it is a challenge. Clean, confident, direct. This phrase anchors your perspective in the conversation without dominating it. It says, I have a point of view, and I'm sharing it with you. What do you think? Phrase 45. We're in agreement on the principle, but. Say it. We're in agreement on the principle, but. We're in agreement on the principle, but. This phrase is one of the most sophisticated disagreement openers in the language. It acknowledges shared ground before introducing the point of divergence. When you say, we're in agreement on the principle, you're connecting. You're reducing defensiveness. And then, but, you introduce the real discussion. We're in agreement on the principle. We should move quickly. Where I think we differ is on what quickly actually means here. We're in agreement on the principle that quality matters most. The question is how we define quality in this specific context. We're in agreement on the principle, but the details of the implementation are where I have concerns. We're in agreement on the principle, but I think the execution plan needs more work. Good, again. We're in agreement on the principle. Where I'd push back is on the timeline. This phrase prevents debates from becoming entrenched. When you can honestly say, we share the same underlying value, the same fundamental goal, then the disagreement becomes a question of means, not ends. That's a much more productive conversation to have. We're now in the final movement of this session. I want to give you a set of phrases that are slightly shorter, more immediate, more conversational, but no less sophisticated. These are the phrases that native speakers reach for in the flow of live conversation, not just in formal settings. That's a reasonable concern. Say it. That's a reasonable concern. I'm glad you raised that. Say it. I'm glad you raised that. That's an interesting way to frame it. Say it. That's an interesting way to frame it. I think there's merit in both positions. Say it. I think there's merit in both positions. Let's not lose sight of the bigger picture. Say it. Let's not lose sight of the bigger picture. I'd welcome your thoughts on this. Say it. I'd welcome your thoughts on this. That's worth unpacking. Say it. That's worth unpacking. I think we're saying the same thing in different ways. Say it. I think we're saying the same thing in different ways. I appreciate the candor. Say it. I appreciate the candor. Let's take a step back. Say it. Let's take a step back. Say all of those again, quickly, confidently, without pausing. That's a reasonable concern. I'm glad you raised that. That's an interesting way to frame it. I think there's merit in both positions. Let's not lose sight of the bigger picture. I'd welcome your thoughts on this. That's worth unpacking. I think we're saying the same thing in different ways. I appreciate the candor. Let's take a step back. Again, faster now. That's a reasonable concern. I'm glad you raised that. That's an interesting way to frame it. I think there's merit in both positions. Let's not lose sight of the bigger picture. I'd welcome your thoughts on this. That's worth unpacking. I think we're saying the same thing in different ways. I appreciate the candor. Let's take a step back. You're moving now. You're not translating. You're retrieving. That's the boundary we're crossing. Let's do one final extended practice. I'm going to describe a complex professional situation, and I want you, completely on your own, pausing the video if you need to construct a response of 30 to 60 seconds, using as many of these phrases as feel natural. Here's the situation. Your company has been considering a significant change in strategy. You've been part of the working group that analyzed the options. A senior manager asks you in a meeting, "So, what's your overall read on where we are?" Take a moment, think about what you'd say, and then speak. Here's an example response to model and inspire you. Broadly speaking, I think we've made real progress in understanding the situation. That said, to be frank with you, I think it's premature to commit to a specific direction just yet. The evidence suggests we're dealing with something more nuanced than we initially anticipated, and the implications are significant. On reflection, I'd argue that the core issue here is that we haven't yet aligned on our priorities. We're in agreement on the principle that we need to change. Where I think we differ is on the pace and the scope of that change. I take your point that there's urgency here, and I wouldn't go so far as to say we should slow down entirely. But at this juncture, I'd be inclined to recommend we take 2 or 3 weeks to address some of the open questions before we commit. What I'm hearing from the team is that they want clarity, and I think we owe them that. Read that back through. Notice every phrase from today's session inside it. Notice how they connect. Notice how the ideas flow. Notice how that response sounds measured, intelligent, and professionally authoritative, without being aggressive, without being vague, and without being simple. That's what we've been building toward all session. Say a version of it now. Your version, in your context. Speak. Good. I want to say something as we approach the end of this session. Something I mean genuinely. Many people who study English at your level, advanced learners, serious professionals, people who have already invested years in this language. Many of them have a quiet frustration. They know they're intelligent. They know their ideas are good. And yet, in the moment, in real conversations, the language doesn't quite match the quality of the thinking. There's a gap. And that gap is painful because it feels like a misrepresentation. Like the version of you that comes through in English is slightly smaller than the version that exists in your mind. The phrases we've practiced today won't close that gap overnight. Nothing does that. But they are the kind of language that genuinely begins to close it. Not by making you sound sophisticated, but by giving your sophisticated thinking the tools it needs to be expressed. Clearly, precisely. When you say, I'd argue that the core issue here is, you're not performing. You're thinking clearly and speaking that clarity out loud. When you say, it's a nuanced situation and I think rushing would be costly, you're not using fancy language for its own sake. You're being accurate. You're seeing something real and saying it truly. That's the English I want for you. Not impressive English, true English. English that represents you fully. Here's your practice commitment for this week. Choose 10 phrases from today's session. Just 10. Write them on a piece of paper or in your phone. Somewhere you'll see them. Every day for the next 7 days, use 2 or 3 of them in real conversations. Not rehearsed, real. With a colleague, in an email, in a meeting, in a discussion. Notice when the right phrase arrives naturally. Notice when it doesn't. Come back and practice the ones that don't yet flow. In 7 days, those 10 phrases will be yours. Not things you heard once in a video. Yours. Part of how you speak. Then choose 10 more. This is how it's done. Not in great leaps. In consistent, intelligent, daily practice. The way water shapes stone. Not with force, but with patience and return. One more thing before we close. If you work in an environment where English is the professional language, where meetings, presentations, negotiations, emails all happen in English, I want you to understand something. Every phrase you genuinely own, every expression that arrives naturally and accurately in the right moment, does not just make you sound better. It changes how you feel. Because when you have the language to express your thinking with precision, you stop editing yourself. You stop holding back the full version of your idea because you're not sure you can articulate it clearly. You stop that invisible self-censorship that is one of the most exhausting aspects of operating in a second language. Advanced English phrases aren't luxuries, they're instruments, tools of professional liberation. Use them, own them, let them serve you. This is Easy English with Sage. I'll be here tomorrow and the day after that, and every day after that, with exactly this kind of practice. Serious, immersive, mature. Designed for people who take their English and themselves seriously. If today's session was useful, subscribe. Not for me, for you. Because consistency is the engine, and having a daily place to practice, to return to grow, that matters. Type a phrase in the comments, any phrase from today. Use it in a sentence from your own life. That single act, that 10 seconds of writing, is more useful than you know. It's the bridge between hearing and owning. Until next time, keep practicing, keep returning, keep speaking. The language is yours. You're already further along than you think. And every day that you show up, even briefly, even imperfectly, you are becoming someone for whom English is not just a tool, but a home. I'll see you in the next session.